China is winning the trade war against the US despite sanctions imposed on it by the US government. These sanctions were supposed to cripple the Chinese and stop the growth of its economy. Rather than do that, the opposite has been the case. Hello and welcome to yet another exciting episode on our channel. In this video, we will show you how China is winning the trade war with the US and why the Chinese economy continues to grow post-COVID. Before the outbreak of COVID last year, China was already outperforming every major economy across the world. It was one of the fastest growing economies, posting massive trade surpluses. The second biggest economy in 2020, with a trade surplus of $78 billion, despite being the origin of the COVID virus. According to the official statistic released by the Chinese, rather than shrink, China's overall trade surplus hit an all-time high of $535 billion, which is 27% higher than that of 2019. Consequently, Chinese exports continued to rise. Many countries in the globe traded with China before the pandemic, and this has continued. The impact of the pandemic has made these countries even more reliant on China for supplies. Many analysts have attributed China's tremendous economic successes to the way its administrators managed the pandemic despite breaking out at Wuhan. This was especially true in the electronics and protective gear industry, as many people worked remotely from home. China was one of the first countries to open for business when other countries were still battling with the effects of the virus. Furthermore, the production capacity in many of these countries, including the US, was halted, and many of them were reliant on the Chinese for supplies of COVID-related goods. Before 2020, the trade relationship between China and the US was imbalanced. During and after COVID, it became even more so. How? From estimates released by different agencies, China's overall trade surplus with the US has continued to rise and reached $317 billion in 2020. This 7% increase, that was the second highest ever, was unexpected by US policymakers. If you recall, former President Donald Trump launched a trade war with China in 2018 for the lopsided trade relationship the US had with China. However, imports from China continued to rise despite Trump's trade war. So rather than weakening the Chinese, it strengthened them. These results are coming days before the Chinese release GDP figures for 2020, which many expect to be positive, just like the other indices. In a Reuters analyst poll, experts believe that the GDP increase will be at least 2.1% for 2020. So while many world economies, including that of the US, contracted, China grew. From the look of things, China will continue to dominate trade by playing a critical role in the supply chain for many commodities. The Asian economic powerhouse is a production hub and remains a very vibrant economy. The mere fact that many countries rely on Chinese industries for critical supplies will make it very difficult to decouple from it. Despite the unsuccessful attempts of Trump's China trade policy, political observers do not expect the new US government to remove the sanctions completely. Joe Biden has been critical of the sanctions from day one. However, the new US president has kept many of his predecessors' trade policies in place. President Biden has taken a less combative approach with the Chinese compared to Trump. Furthermore, the US president is exploring other ways to make Beijing more accountable. However, it will be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to remove all the tariffs President Trump placed on Chinese goods. When Donald Trump was a Republican candidate in 2016, he built his campaign around several arguments, one of which was the trade imbalance with China. His argument was that China was ripping off the US and that most of the deals between both countries were often in favor of the Chinese to the detriment of the US. He imposed certain tariffs on Chinese goods, prompting Beijing to enter into negotiations with China. The negotiations were done in two phases. The first phase was a commitment by China to buy an additional $200 billion worth of American goods by 2021. Not too long after the deal was inked, the signs were positive for the US, but as time dragged on, the deal appeared to hurt the US. Why? Simply because there were certain underlying issues that the trade deal did not solve. To better understand why the US and former President Trump had to declare a trade war against China in the first place, we have to look back at the 2016 presidential election. As candidate Trump and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton battled it out at their respective presidential campaigns, Trump was consistent in his criticisms of not just China, but the many US businesses and businessmen who did business with China. His argument was that the Chinese were guilty of intellectual property theft and caused the loss of many US manufacturing jobs. According to the Republican candidate, the Chinese was responsible for the biggest theft in history, like Donald Trump preferred to call China's trade activities. As at 2016, the US trade deficit stood at $346 billion. On several occasions during his campaign across the US, he was quoted as saying, "We can't allow China to rape our country." By cultivating an image of being the ultimate deal-maker, he declared his intention to review the trade relationship between both countries and pledged to cut a better deal that will make American businesses more competitive. He released a 4-point plan to address the issue. His first plan was to declare China a currency manipulator. The second plan was to confront China's intellectual property theft practices. The third one was to end the export subsidies that China had enjoyed over the years and its lax labor laws. The fourth plan was to lower the corporate tax rate to American companies more competitive. True to his word, upon winning the election and starting his term as president, he engaged Beijing with the goal of addressing the issues. 3 months after entering office, he met Xi Jinping of China at Mar-a-Lago, Florida, and in the meeting, both leaders established a 100-day action plan to resolve the trade imbalance. The following month, the Chinese government agreed to open up sections of its economy to US firms in exchange for more access to bilateral trade and the US's recognition for China's Belt and Road agenda. Unfortunately, the negotiations hit a brick wall after US negotiators pressed for more concessions, which Beijing refused. After the 100-day plan ended, no agreements were reached and Trump declared that negotiations were dead in the water. Following the statement, the then US president started the trade war to put Beijing under pressure to implement significant changes to its trade policies. Trump wanted China to address issues relating to forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, limited market access, and subsidies to state-owned firms. His argument was that the trade deal will reduce America's trade deficit and cause Chinese firms to bring their production to the US. So between July 2018 to August 2019, Washington imposed tariffs amounting to more than $550 billion on Chinese goods. China retaliated with tariffs of more than $185 billion on US goods, and that was how the trade war commenced. So what has been the economic cost of the China-US trade war? Well, what we do know is that the trade war caused significant economic pain for both countries and led to a diversion of significant trade from both countries. The US economy slowed and investments were not as liquid as they should have been. The slow growth was felt by a section of the agro-industry who relied on access to the Chinese market to stay afloat. The transport sector, especially freight companies, also felt the pinch. According to Moody's Analytics, the trade war cost about 0.7% of US GDP in 2019 and a dollar cost of about $316 billion. Companies in the US also lost about $1.7 trillion in stock value. The Chinese also felt the impact of the tariffs the Trump administration placed on its goods, but to what extent were these impacts? Outsiders cannot say for sure because the Chinese Communist Party are not very forthcoming with their data. Beijing is notorious for over-reporting its gains and hiding its losses, so this is not surprising. What is clear is that China lowered its tariff for other trading partners, which further reduced its reliance on goods it once ordered from the US market. By January 15, 2021, the deal the US and China eventually signed was similar to the one Beijing wanted to sign all along, which was to increase its purchase of US goods, improve protections for US intellectual property, and to stop forced technology transfer. China appears to be winning, but what will the US response be? The rest of the world continues to watch. Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. Also, kindly subscribe to our channel for more videos. Thanks for watching.